Hi, Rhema. It's week 43, day 5 of our Bible narrative reading plan, and we've come in the narrative to the night before our Lord's death. We're going to spend time in Matthew 26 and then also 1 Corinthians 11. If you want to read more, just keep in mind that John chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all take place the night before our Lord was crucified. They're all part of that upper room discourse, is the way those chapters are usually referred to. They all take place during this time period that we read about in Matthew 26. So for further reading, consult John chapters 13 through 17. But we begin Matthew 26 and verse 14 with the plot of Judas to betray Jesus. One of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, he goes to the 12 priests. He asks them, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. From that moment, he seeks an opportunity to betray Jesus. Now we come to the night of the Passover, the first day of unleavened bread. The disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, where are we going to observe the Passover? Because they keep the feast, they keep the traditions given to them in the Old Testament. And so Jesus gives them instructions on what they should do. That night they're reclining at table with the 12. All of them are gathered together. And as they're eating, Jesus says something troubling. He says, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." They're very sorrowful about this. They begin to ask one another, "Is it I? Is it I? Lord, am I the one that's going to betray you?" And he answers, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." And Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Lord?" He said to him, "You have said so." Judas is clearly the one who's going to betray the Lord, but yet when you read all the Gospels, you see that the other 11 don't fully recognize this at the moment. But Jesus knows what's happening, and Judas knows what's happening. And eventually, in the story, we see John tells us it's at this point, I believe, that Judas leaves and goes out seeking to betray the Lord. And now the 11 are left for the institution of the Lord's Supper. Verse 26, now as they're eating, Jesus takes bread, he blesses it, and he institutes the Lord's Supper. More on that in just a moment in 1 Corinthians 11. But after that, we'll notice verse 29, "I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit and of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." A reminder of what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11, that as often as you drink this bread, drink this cup and eat this bread, you do proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. But then after that, they sung a hymn. They go out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus tells them, "You're all going to fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Pay attention to that. He tells them, after I'm raised up, after the resurrection, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. And Peter, of course, not hearing what Jesus actually says, he focuses on a small portion and he says, "Lord, I will never betray you." And Jesus tells him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter, again, he says, "I'm not going to do it." And the disciples say, "I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to betray you." And we know the story, and we'll read more of it next week. But before we conclude, look quickly at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul tells us about the Lord's Supper. Now, think carefully about this. The Gospels were written at a certain time. The New Testament letters were written at a certain time in a certain year. The same way you and I write things down, these were all written in certain times, even if they're pointing back to something that already happened. So in the Gospels, they're telling us what happened chronologically, what their events, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, take place before the writing of the letters. But the letters, some of them were written before the Gospels. I hope that makes sense. So Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, we believe, was written before these Gospels were recorded, before they were written down. So the first written testimony that Christians would have had about the Lord's Supper actually comes from the letter of 1 Corinthians. Now, when you compare it with the Gospels, it all meshes together. It's all consistent with one another. But the first thing that Christians would have had to teach them about the Lord's Supper would have been 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And Paul gives those familiar instructions. We read them every time we gather at the Lord's table. We see the importance, the significance of the Lord's Supper. Baptists often we don't want to take the Lord's Supper too much because we don't want it to become too common. But our Lord, we don't want to seem Catholic, but our Lord has given us a very important means of grace, some theologians call it. It's an important thing that Christ has given to nurture us. Now, there's nothing magical happening, but in a spiritual way, God is nourishing us through the Lord's Supper, knowing that one day we will gather with our Lord in heaven, in His presence forever. We will be with Him forever at the marriage supper of the Lamb, and we will feast with and on Jesus for all of eternity. How glorious that will be. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.